Hello and welcome to a quick video about writing literature reviews. So the first thing I have in front of me is what I call the literature review outline. And basically the literature review outline is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of a general idea about what a literature review looks like. Generally speaking, a literature review, as you see here, it starts with an introduction. You're going to describe the overall topic that you have been investigating, why it is important to the field, and why you are interested in that topic. So that's usually like the first couple of sentences. You also identify any themes and trends in your research questions, methodology, and findings. You want to give a big picture of the literature just to kind of whet people's appetites. And then, of course, you're going to have a clear thesis statement and a preview. And that's all of your introduction. And that's usually anything from a page to a page and a half, depending on how complicated the introduction actually is. From there, you move into the various themes that you are going to cover within your literature review. So here's what I have in front of me. I have what I call Theme A. And basically Theme A, it could be almost anything. It could be a specific variable. It could be a theory that you're exploring. It could be, if you're doing a rhetorical research study, something like Theme A could be, the history of the artifacts that you're studying. There's a number of different ways that Theme A could be approached, and it really kind of depends on your own individual study. But generally speaking, how it works is you have an overview of characteristics of the theme. Oftentimes, depending on what it is, you need to provide a definition of a specific concept. And we're going to look at an example here in just a few minutes. But usually within that, you're going to have a number of sub-themes. And so you kind of clump information. Now, what I always say when it comes to writing a literature review is you're telling a story. You're creating a narrative about what the research that exists on this topic says. So it doesn't matter if you're looking at like employee motivation or you're looking at job satisfaction, you're telling us the story of that specific variable. Now, as you can see here, it says sub-theme, and it says study 1, study 2, study 3. It's not like you go, then study 1, study 2, study 3 is in 3 different paragraphs. I'm just saying that within each sub-theme, you're going to have multiple studies that you are going to discuss. So a individual sub-theme is not just going to be a specific research article. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes that novice literature review writers make is that each paragraph is a different study. It more reads like what we would call an annotated bibliography. So it's basically like you took a bunch of abstracts from different articles, and in one paragraph is one abstract. The next paragraph is a different abstract. That's disjointed. In fact, if I can put all your different paragraphs on index cards and shuffle them around and it doesn't change the meaning, then we don't have a very good narrative going on. So again, the big important thing is you're telling us a story about this literature. Now, depending on what you're doing, you could have 4 or 5 sub-themes. It really just depends on what your literature area is. Now, then of course you have different themes beyond that. Depending on how many variables you have in your study, you could have 4 or 5 different themes. It really just kind of it depends on what it is that you're looking at. And then of course you're going to have a general conclusion to literature review, where you're going to talk about the contributions of this literature, the overall strengths, weaknesses, what may be missing, and then of course what are the next steps, more specifically what it is that you're going to be doing in your literature. So this is a very generic outline. So let's look at an actual study that I have here for you. So what I've done is I've actually gone through a paper that was previously written in this class, and I have annotated the entire paper, and I put little notes in it. You'll see over here, like I have information about, like, notice that the running head is 1/2 inch from the top of the paper. The text is left justified, and it's in all capital letters, and the number is right justified. So I put some of these APA things in here, and I've also put some grammar things and just some general writing things just for you to pay attention to as you are going through this document. Now, I'm only going to hit the highlights, so I'm not going to hit every little thing in here. I just want to hit some of the big important parts that are specifically related to what we're talking about. So I'm going to skip the abstract. You can read all of that and look at all those notes. I do want to come right here. This is the first page of your actual paper. You're going to notice that the title is again right here at the top, and it's bolded and centered. And then you start your very first paragraph. Notice with any paragraph, it is always indented that 1/2 inch. And every paragraph is like that also. notice over here on the right-hand side that it's not what we call justified. Let me show you what justified looks like. I'm going to click on this button. See how suddenly all of that is perfectly aligned? That's not what we want. We want it like this. It's what's called ragged. And so that's what we call traditional left justified. And that's what we want it to look like. Other things to look for in this is you'll notice if you read this, it's a generic introduction. It talks about workplace friendships, which is what this specific study is about. It talks a little bit about survival and why friendships are important. And then, of course, it comes right down here and it says, this study will research workplace friendships as a whole, in addition to the effects workplace friendships have on coworker relational maintenance, emotional labor, job satisfaction, and employee motivation. So right there, we know that we have a preview of what is going to get covered in this literature review. We're going to expect to see sections on workplace friendships, which if you see right here, there's the first section. I'm also going to expect to see sections on coworker relational maintenance, emotional labor, and then job satisfaction and employee motivation. So it's previewed what's actually expected to be seen. So we then get into the very, very first section, which is on workplace friendships. And so this whole section and how it is designed, it's designed to give us that information as to what are workplace friendships, and more specifically is what have we found about workplace friendships in the literature itself. And so if you kind of go through here, it starts off pretty general. It talks more about general friendships, and then it goes on and talks a little bit about the obstacles of friendships, and then it kind of gets down in here into more and more about why workplace friendships are positive and negative. So you'll see that we've have some themes already. We started off with what is workplace friendships, why they're important, and now we've gotten into how they are, can be positive and negative. So we've already created some themes within this section. Then it talks a little bit about what we call the primary tensions in friendships, which is a different thing. And if you keep going through, you're going to see a number of different themes throughout the entire thing. Now, when you get to the end, this is one thing I want you to pay attention to, is right down here we have Stepanek 2015 states that many of the negative effects of workplace friendships may only be phases, and if not, notice this, with proper friendship maintenance or coworker relational maintenance can be mended or eventually avoided. So notice what we've just done there. We've actually set up the next section. And that's one of those things that is really good whenever you write a literature review, is when you get towards the end of one section, you set up that next section. Just because, again, it links things together and makes it read as if it is a common paper and not a bunch of disjointed sections. Okay, I'm going to keep on going. You're going to notice, just as an FYI, the word coworker and APA styled is not hyphenated. So just keep that in the back of your mind, because I'm sure you're going to write the word coworker a lot. It's just kind of par for the course. I'm skipping through a lot of stuff in here. And again, most of what I'm skipping through is like APA reminders, a lot of the things that we talked about last week. So just pay attention to that. The next section here, as you're going to see, is on emotional labor, which is a different term. And one of the things I want you to see here is right off the bat, it provides a definition. One of the things I want you to know is, in a typical literature review, in a given section, you may only have one, maybe two direct quotations. As such, it is very important to use your direct quotations sparingly. So you really need to think through, okay, which direct quotations are important? And generally speaking, it's things that are like theoretical explanations that you really can't paraphrase very well, or definitions. That's really when we want to use a direct quotation. We don't just want direct quotations for everything. And one of the problems that I saw with this specific paper is there's a lot of direct quotations when they realistically could have paraphrased information better. So I'm going to keep going through this section on emotional labor. And again, I want to get down to the next section. Again, I highlighted this one. This is another one where it is a good transition from that emotional labor section into the section on job satisfaction and employee motivation. And again, you're going to notice right here that they've included a direct quotation to define the term job satisfaction, which is a great use of a direct quotation. I'm going to scroll through because I want to get to the rationale section. Here we go. The rationale section is a very important part of your literature review. It's kind of where you tie everything together and you propose what we call hypotheses and or research questions. Now, a hypothesis is an argument. It's basically where you can link pieces of literature together to form a hypothesis. So you're basically saying that, it's like the old-fashioned syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Except in this case, we're using literature. So here is an example of one. So it starts off with, friendships require maintenance to preserve. Maintenance is easier with a number of favorable social contingencies. Working within the same organization is a favorable contingency to help with friendship maintenance. Okay, so now we have friendships and we have maintenance and co-worker relational maintenance. So Saya states that many of us spend more time with our peer coworkers than we do with our family and friends, which is true, thus making it easier to want to maintain relationships with coworkers, especially if they are our friends. So workplace friendships will have a positive relationship with coworker relational maintenance. So what we basically did in the first part is we talked about here are our friendships. We talked about why friendships are important, but also why people that have workplace friendships are going to be more likely to use coworker relational maintenance strategies. And we said that there's going to be a positive relationship between them. Thus, we can make a hypothesis and predict that workplace friendships will have a positive relationship with coworker relational maintenance. That is a good example of how you set up an actual argument that leads to a hypothesis. Now, oftentimes, the literature is not as clear-cut as this one was. And when that happens, you may have contradictory information, or you just can't make any clear links. When that happens, that is when we ask what we call a research question. And a research question is exactly what it sounds like. You're asking a question because, again, you can't make an actual prediction. And so you can kind of scroll through the rest of the section and you'll see over and over again multiple hypotheses. From there, you get to what's called the methods section. The methods, first thing you're always going to see is the participants, and that is who was in your study. And a lot of this, especially if you're doing a survey, I have a standard set of information that we collect. That way it's just all the same. And so you can actually go through this and get a good idea about the kinds of just general demographic information we collect when we're doing survey research in organizational communication. You then talk about your procedures. Now, obviously, your procedures are going to differ depending on which type of research you're doing. If you're doing qualitative, you're going to want to talk about, how did you get your focus groups? How did you put them together? If you're doing observational data, where did you observe? How did you get access? What types of observations did you make? How did you take notes? All of those types of things you explain in your procedure section. From there, we get to a section that is predominantly for your quantitative, especially your survey studies. And that's what we call the instrumentation section. And the instrumentation section is where you explain the different measures that you used. And you can kind of go through here and read. These are just pretty generic examples of what these sections look like. And it's pretty well written. There's a lot of information there for you. Again, I'm scrolling through it because not everyone is going to need this. Now, when it comes to your literature review, this is as far as you go. Again, the literature review is going to contain your literature, your rationale, and your method section. Of course, at this point, it's going to be a proposed method section, so you won't have all of these. Say if you're doing a study, you're not going to have all these numbers. So when that happens, you just put X's. So I'm going to go back up here to the participants as an example real fast. So let's say on the very first one, we have 215 participants. Well, we're not going to know that. So we're going to say we're going to have, I'm just going to type it here, X number of participants. And that's how you would actually do that when you're writing this up as a literature review. So any of these numbers, you would just simply put X's there, and that just makes it easier for you later when we actually get those numbers. From there, again, I'm getting a little bit beyond, but I do at least want to show you this. You have what's called the results section. This is exactly what it sounds like. This is where you actually provide your results, and depending on the type of study, these results will differ. I'm going to keep going. Then you get your discussion section. This is where you make heads or tails as what it is you actually found. One of the parts of the discussion is what we call your limitations, where you explain any of the limitations that were related in your study. And then, of course, you always have future directions. And this is basically, where do you think this research needs to head in the future? So these are some of the basic things. And then, of course, the last thing you're always going to have is your references. And again, you're going to notice I have made a lot of comments in here about specific issues related to APA style and your references. Again, most of these we've talked about, but I went ahead and really highlighted them here and put out those little call notes just to make your life a little bit easier. So this is, again, a pretty, standard paper. Now, last thing I want you to look at is this document right here. I call it Writing Like an Academic. Just as an FYI, it's actually all came from this wonderful little book. It's called The Only Academic Phrasebook You'll Ever Need, 600 Examples of Academic Language. And basically what this guy did is he realized that academics have a really bad habit of talking about things in the same way over and over again. And so what he did is he looked through all of the literature and put together a list of how we phrase things. And so this is kind of a good way of thinking about it, because this kind of lets you see how we transition things and what types of things you want to look like. Like, how do we establish a research territory? It's like blank has received a lot of research attention, or blank has led to a renewed interest in blank. And you can kind of go through here. I'm not going to read all of these to you. Also want to be active voice. A number of recent studies have examined, investigated, focused on, reported on. Scroll through. If there's general agreement among scholars, you could say it is now generally accepted that blank, and then you provide your parenthetical citations there. If there's gaps in the research, here's a whole section on examples of gaps, like blank deserves more research attention, or research on blank has relied primarily on this. If there's previous research that has largely been overlooked, you can see that. If there's contradictory research, which often happens, here's an example. Most scholars seem to agree that blank, however, there continues to be a debate about blank, or blank has been the subject of research since blank, however, blank. So again, this is kind of showing you how within these different sections or these sub-themes of your literature, how we write about this stuff. Again, you can kind of still go through this whole document. I'm not going to read it for you. Then it talks about, this is a good section to kind of think about how the end of this section, especially at the end of the introduction, when you're going to do that preview, you could say it's divided into blank sections or is organized into these sections. Just as a way of doing that, here's section N. So this is like this first section provides an overview of blank, or it provides a reasonably comprehensive overview of, let's say, job satisfaction. Again, kind of showing you how we use these things. Keeping going, you see the same thing. Let's say a number of scholars have conducted research on blank, suggested that blank. So again, you're going to see a lot of these same ideas over and over. And the last part here, I just showed you some different ways that you can do. The first section, just simple narrative citations. And the second one is, what if you have comparisons? So like, for example, Smith, 1600, cited in Jones, 1799, defines blank as blank. Or as Smith, 1799, points out from Jones's 1600 research, blank. Or Smith, 1799, claimed that blank. In a similar vein, Jones 1801 also found that blank. So again, I kind of like this little book because it just shows you some of the ways that researchers generally talk and phrase a lot of the things that we do and how we write literature. And so you'll notice that a lot of this is pretty straightforward. And I know if you've never written a literature review, it is definitely a daunting and scary task. But as I've always say, the only way to really learn how to write a literature review is to dive right in and start writing a literature review. So I hope this video helps you have at least a little bit better understanding of how a literature review works. I'm also going to provide you some other links to some videos that hopefully will give you even more depth and insight into this wonderful and fascinating world of writing a literature review.